Welcome to The Landscape, your show about America's parks and public lands. I'm Aaron Weiss at the Center for Western Priorities. Outside in beautiful Evergreen, Colorado, I would call this unseasonably warm, but as they say, this is going to be the coldest spring of the rest of your life. Kate is still out for a few more weeks, so I am flying solo today. Our guest is Alan Spears with the National Parks Conservation Association. Alan just testified before the House Natural Resources Committee for a hearing about the Trump administration's plans for the America 250 celebration this summer. Alan's testimony was compelling, it was powerful, it warned about efforts to sanitize or erase American history in our parks and historic sites. Alan made the case that Americans can handle a complex history and that confronting the full story of America, peaceful, violent, beautiful, racist, and everything in between, is itself patriotic. But before we get to that conversation with Alan, let's do the news. Chris D'Angelo at Public Domain dropped a new investigation today, this is Thursday, based on documents obtained through a FOIA request that we filed at the Center for Western Priorities. It's about Karen Budd-Falen, Interior's Associate Deputy Secretary. That's the number 3 official at the department. It centers on a pretty straightforward question. Why is Karen Budd-Falen working on grazing policy when she signed ethics documents saying that she wouldn't? Now, back in 2018, during her first stint at Interior, Karen Budd-Falen signed a disqualification statement pledging to recuse herself from, quote, any discussion of grazing matters or the department's process for issuing grazing permits. Now, that's not ambiguous. That is a bright line. She signed it because she and her husband have stakes in multiple ranching operations, some of which hold federal grazing permits to run hundreds of thousands of cattle on public land. So, fast forward today. Karen Budd-Falen is back at Interior in an even bigger role, and her ranching assets haven't changed much. But that recusal may have quietly disappeared. Budd-Falen was tapped by Interior Secretary Doug Burgum to broker a resolution to a grazing dispute at Point Reyes in California, where ranchers and conservationists had reached a deal under the Biden administration to mostly wind down cattle operations at that national seashore. RFK Jr., of all people, tried to blow that deal up. Burgum sent in Karen Budd-Falen to handle it. She also recently helped roll out Interior Department's NEPA overhaul, which the department's own press release explicitly says will benefit livestock grazing approvals on public lands. Now, Chris D'Angelo at Public Domain asked Interior whether those 2018 ethics documents are still in effect, and the department just didn't respond. But the day after he asked the question, a conflict of interest waiver suddenly appeared in the Office of Government Ethics database. But the Interior Department won't say what's in it. Now, if all of this sounds kind of familiar, it's because Karen Budd-Falen is already under scrutiny in a separate ethics mess. Public Domain and High Country News revealed in December that her husband sold water rights from one of the family's ranching operations to Lithium Nevada, that is the developer of the controversial Thacker Pass mine. At that time, of course, Karen Budd-Falen was a top legal official at Interior during the first Trump term. The New York Times later reported the deal was worth $3.5 million, and on her financial disclosure forms, Karen Budd-Falen listed her income from that ranch as less than $201 a year, at the same time that the ranch was bringing in hundreds of thousands of dollars in payments from the mine. She never disclosed the water sale. Members of the House have called on Interior's Inspector General to investigate. Craig Holman, a government ethics expert at Public Citizen, told Chris D'Angelo the problem isn't the recusal itself, it's that nobody's enforcing anything. As he put it, Trump has, quote, neutered the very agencies charged with enforcing governmental ethics. So we've got grazing recusals that she ignores, a multi-million-dollar water deal she didn't disclose, financial ties still to the industry that she regulates. At some point, you stop calling these things oversights and start calling them part of the job description. Now, not unrelated to all of this, SFGate reported this week that the Interior Department has blacklisted their entire National Parks desk. One employee said SFGate is the only publication they have been told to stonewall, and that they've responded to other outlets on the same subjects. Interior Communications Director called SFGate reporters bloggers and said their questions sometimes appear to be written by Democrat operatives, not journalists. This is definitely a pattern here. Public domain is also regularly ignored by Interior on questions about Karen Budd-Falen. When the Interior Department doesn't like the questions, they just stop answering the phone or responding to emails. Former Park Service Director John Jarvis, who spent 40 years there under Democrat and Republican administrations, he told SFGate he's never seen anything like this. He called it, quote, a new era of message control. Our guest today is Alan Spears. Alan is the Senior Director of Cultural Resources in the Government Affairs Department at the National Parks Conservation Association. He serves as NPCA's resident historian and cultural resources expert. Alan, welcome to The Landscape.
Aaron, it's great to be with you today. Thank you.
So you've spent decades at NPCA working to establish sites like the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument, Stonewall National Monument. So I want to start with asking a personal question. What is it like for you on a personal level to watch the National Park Service, a longtime partner with you on these efforts, be forced now by this administration to dismantle the stories that you've spent your career helping them tell?
Well, it hurts. I think it's meant to hurt. I think we have policies that are being implemented by the administration at this point in time that are unnecessary, punitive, and un-American. And I think there are a couple of different tragedies or elements of tragedy to this, where we are right now. The first is that we're heading into the 250th anniversary of American independence from Great Britain, a signature anniversary, and an opportunity really to bring people together to talk about, to commemorate who we are as a people and where we've been and where we're going. And by the way, I don't mean come together in agreement. I mean come together to have sometimes conversations that are going to be challenging about where we've been and how we've gotten to where we are right now, but also an opportunity to commemorate the fact that we've come together and created this progress, and that we are still trudging towards a more perfect union. I think that's the good thing that this anniversary could compel. But it seems like, given the policies that are happening right now, one of the elements of tragedy is that we might be having people disassociate themselves from American history, from this anniversary, from the national parks, because we spent a lot of time, as you said, trying to get people interested in national parks and the history that they interpret, the stories that they protect and preserve. And one image is worth 1,000 of my words. And so a month or so ago, when we saw video of National Park Service rangers at Independence Hall taking down interpretation about African American or African enslaved people at the president's house that were serving George Washington, I think that served to convince a number of people that no, actually, this agency is not on our side. They are not protecting our stories. And maybe national parks aren't relevant to African American folks in this country. And that was unfortunate because the Park Service folks were acting under duress. They were acting under orders. But the other part of this that overlaps, if we were doing a sort of Venn diagram of sorrow here, it's that over the last 30 years, the National Park Service has really taken great strides towards telling the full story of this country in ways that are accurate, inclusive, and just. And so they were one of the first agencies, one of the first large groups to think about or identify African and African American slavery as root causes of the American Civil War. The Park Service has expanded the number of civil rights sites in their network, but they also protect and manage programs like the Underground Railroad Network to Freedom Program, the National Heritage Area System, the Historic American Building Survey, the Historic American Engineering Record, the National Register of Historic Places, and the National Historic Landmarks Program. In other words, this is an agency that is all about the democratization of the process of preservation in this country. And we were getting more people to understand that learning about the Park Service, being aware, advocating for the parks, being a steward, being a lover of national parks was a good thing. It's a good investment of your time and your resources. And we are seeing that progress undermined and reversed.
Last month, you testified about that removal of exhibits at Independence Historical Park at the President's House site. When an order comes down to physically erase the history of a marginalized group from one of the foundational sites in Americans' history. What's the ripple effect on the morale and the daily work of the park rangers who are there, who presumably took these jobs because they want to tell that full story?
Well, it's important that I do this disclosure at the front. I don't work for the National Park Service, have never worked for the National Park Service, but what we're hearing and what we're seeing is that morale within the agency was already subterranean. And now you have an administration that is basically questioning the work ethic and the effectiveness of National Park Service employees, creating a set of circumstances where people feel like they are cowed, that they can't speak freely. And even if you're at a park where nothing has been targeted for removal, you might still be under a set of circumstances where do you share honest interpretation with the public? Because ever since last summer, thanks to the secretarial order, 3431 from Mr. Burgum, responding to and supporting the president's earlier executive order on restoring truth and sanity that was released in March of 2025, you've got these QR codes in place. And the entire purpose of QR codes in these highly visible sections of the park, front doors, counters where the visitors are going to show up, is for people to tattle on the National Park Service. If you see them doing anything that's a little bit too left or a little bit too woke or that denigrates Americans past or living, with air quotes around denigrate, because denigrate can oftentimes sound a lot like truth-telling, then you report it in, and the interpretive person, ranger who's responsible for that interpretation, could get themselves in some substantial trouble. And so the weight that is now on the shoulders of our colleagues in the National Park Service is more intense than ever. And again, we do these overlapping Venn diagrams of sorrow and frustration. And a part of that is, again, thanks to the administrations emanating from the Trump administration, we saw 4,000 permanent employees lost from the National Park Service in 2025 alone. It's about 25% of the workforce. And so that's also a significant hit. They were coming through government efficiencies, fork in the road buyouts, layoffs, and a federal hiring freeze that kept those positions from being refilled once they were lapsed. And so you're getting just nothing but hits after hits after hits if you are in the National Park Service at this point in time. So morale is down. I think some of that is from the circumstances that people are facing, the shutdown, the lack of respect coming from this administration, and then also kind of the history erasure thing. National Park Service employees really care about the quality of their interpretation. And in many of these instances, if you're at a national park, before you put up a photograph of an enslaved person with a scourged back from whipping, you're going to vet that with your peers, historians outside the agency, descendant communities, people of all stripes in the community. Then you're going to determine whether or not that goes up on a wall. And although we think the scourged back photograph is still at Fort Pulaski, other things have come down. And so I think in terms of that has a negative impact on morale. And I maybe just round out this point by saying the personnel that are left should be allowed, unimpaired, to protect and preserve the natural, historic, and cultural resources in their charge, and not have to manage a censorship campaign for the federal government.
So I want to talk about Freedom 250, which is a lot of what we're talking about in that hearing. The president's executive orders and Doug Burgum's orders say that our history on public lands has to be unifying, inspiring, and ennobling. So, I mean, what do you say to folks who say, okay, yes, history is good and important, but we're celebrating America's 250, just make that an uncomplicated, feel-good, rah-rah America celebration?
Yeah, so what I would say to that is no. Respectfully, no. Listen, we're Americans and we can walk, chew gum, and think difficult thoughts at the same time. It's not that hard and it's absolutely necessary. And I think I get it that, it reminds me of James Baldwin, and I'm going to horribly paraphrase a quote of his from maybe the 1960s, 1970s, but he was being interviewed about American history. And he said something to the effect of, we sometimes organize our history and our politics in this country in ways that allow the sleeper to stay asleep. And I think his point, as I take it, is the point that I would support and make here, which is I know the word is tarnished at this point in time, but we need a little bit more woke. We need woke because we are citizens in a participatory democracy. There has to be some level of awareness about our history, about where we've come from, because all these things, the good stuff, the bad stuff, the wonder, the warts, all of it is impacting who we are today. Um, and so, if you are going to have history that doesn't mention race, that doesn't mention slavery, that doesn't mention the struggle that women had to gain the right to vote, if we're not going to talk about the uprising at the Stonewall Inn in the summer of 1969 that led to the birth of the modern LGBTQ movement, then what we've got here is history that is the equivalent of this narrative. Pilgrims landed on the East Coast, they moved inland. There was a Thanksgiving celebration they had with some native people. The Civil War happened. Lincoln freed the slaves, and then we elected Barack Obama. The end. Let's go
The
have some
Charlie
hot
Brown history
dogs.
of America.
The Charlie Brown history of America. Um, and I think we are so far beyond that, or we need to be so far beyond that. And my worry is this: it's not just that, I'm a Civil War nerd, I'm an American history nerd, so we could stay in the weeds about, the Missouri Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. We could spend this entire podcast talking about those things, and I would still not exhaust my interest and my curiosity about that. But I think the challenge is that what we're seeing right now come from the administration and from people who support this is maybe an effort to get rid of opportunities for critical thinking. That if we can have that kind of, as you described it, Charlie Brown narrative, that sort of we've had nothing but untrammeled progress from year zero up to where we are now, and it's only going to get better as we move on, that doesn't allow us to think about some of the ways that we are still struggling to make this a more perfect union, many of the ways in which we have failed as a nation to live up to the better angels of our nature, and why that's important, and why maybe understanding the history of race and slavery in this country, of understanding the history of Japanese American internment during the Second World War, can actually provide us with opportunities to not make those same mistakes again, but also to honor and to recognize the commitment of a wide variety of people who have helped to shape this country and its history. Because it's not just been one group, and it's not always been pleasant, but it is us.
The administration sometimes uses the phrase patriotic education, and we see this with the freedom trucks that are now traveling the country with programming created by Christian nationalists at PragerU and Hillsdale College. And I wonder, is there room, is there an opportunity here for a broader conversation on what is actually patriotism? I mean, what to you would be a patriotic history experience at a national park or in our schools for that matter?
That's a very interesting question. I feel like I've gotten a bunch of patriotic experiences at the hands of interpretive rangers working for the National Park Service at places like Harper's Ferry and Gettysburg, Antietam and Shiloh, Yorktown Final Victory, and even at civil rights sites like Birmingham Civil Rights or the Summit of Montgomery Trail. Rangers are steeped in the ability to tell challenging and difficult stories, but in ways that do not obligate you to agree with their assessment. They're simply, it literally is dragnet, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And then from those facts, you can determine what you want to believe. But the challenge is that you've got to be, we as a country have to be in a place where we're getting all of the facts, not just some of the facts. Um, and I think I credited this to Tip O'Neill. It was actually Mr. Moynihan who once said, when he was engaging an opponent in the Senate, that you are entitled to your own beliefs, but not to your own facts. And so I think what we need to do is to square away the fact that, let's say, slavery was a root cause of the American Civil War, and that going back into the founding era, if we want to talk about a patriotic experience, if you'll allow me to go a little bit in depth about this, here's how I would shape that patriotic experience. So George Washington led the Continental Army during that long, bloody American Revolution that actually gained our independence or helped to gain our independence 250 something years ago. He deserves all the credit in the world for that. He then served 2 terms as President of the United States, our first elected president. And at the end of that second term, there were people who were standing next to George Washington and said, "Hey, General, we know some guys with muskets. You know some guys with muskets. We could keep you in this position for as long as you might like." And George Washington said, "No, I believe in the democratic transfer of power. I'm going to stand aside and let the next guy come in. And we are going to continue that process that we have so nobly began. He deserves all the credit for that. Our democratic traditions begin with George Washington. And he owned enslaved people. And he not only owned them, but he brought them with him from Mount Vernon up to Philadelphia, because remember, before there was a Washington, D.C., the president's house and the seat of government was in Philadelphia. He not only brought those people with him from Virginia, but he would shuttle them back and forth so that they would never have the opportunity to say that they had spent so much time in Pennsylvania, where the Commonwealth was working on becoming an emancipated state or free state, that they could make the claim that they were legally free. So he did that. He did these great things. He did these challenging things. He did terrible things, but human beings are complicated folks. And I'm not looking for forgiveness, but I am looking for awareness. And again, I talked about my fear as we head towards this anniversary about disassociating from American history. And that if we want to talk about George Washington as a founding father, then we also have to talk about George Washington as an owner of enslaved people. And those two things sit side by side, at least in my mind and in my heart. And if you don't want to talk about the one, then we may have some challenges about how you want to run things on the 4th of July for 2026 and beyond.
In your testimony, you
Mhm.
you talked about how the quickest way you can disappear people is to disappear their story. And I wonder what are the consequences then of erasing these narratives of enslaved people, of indigenous Americans from our parks and public lands as America is marking, honoring, celebrating its 250th birthday.
Well, our founding era is, like in any other country or nation or tribe, the founding story, the founding era is critically important. And if you are suggesting that certain people really didn't play any meaningful role in that founding era, and that certain people have made no significant positive, lasting contributions to the country, to humanity, to progress, that's one of the first steps in othering people. And then when you go beyond that to start eliminating the history that people have and their contributions to a society, then that makes it very easy to start disappearing them from the landscape. And you start with the people, you start with their history and culture, you take that away, and then all of a sudden there's no basis to have basic citizenship rights. We've been here before. We had a civil war that lasted for 4 bloody years, cost about 750,000 lives, I think. Um, Led to the emancipation of 4 million enslaved African Americans. We got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments coming out of that conflict and Reconstruction. And in a heartbeat like that, what we saw was that there was a rejiggering of American history so that that war was no longer about slavery, no longer about race. It's all about states' rights. We got the rise of the lost cause narrative, and with that ushered in decades of some of the worst racial violence, Jim Crow, discrimination, racism, and those things are still with us to this day. So we've already seen what happens when you say that actually black people weren't really, involved in the Civil War. It wasn't about slavery. We're going to just ignore the fact that 180,000 plus African American men served in the military to help preserve and protect the Union. That history is just gone. We saw where that took us the first time. And I really hope that we are not headed in that direction again, because you can see it with authoritarian regimes. And I'm using those two terms deliberately in this case. I don't think we're there yet, but we are adjacent. And that one of the first places you start is with the erasure of people's history and culture and with the othering process that can initiate. So I hope we haven't reached that tipping point. Maybe you'll get an opportunity to speak with Malcolm Gladwell at some point in time, and he'll be able to tell you, have we gotten to a tipping point or not? I hope we haven't. But I think we are headed in an unfortunate direction.
I think that brings up an interesting question about guardrails and institutional resistance, institutional inertia, perhaps. And we've seen, I think, a mix across the country where obviously the erasure is happening right now at the National Park Service. It seems like the Smithsonian, possibly by virtue of it being a private entity but with government funding, has been somewhat more resistant to that erasure or that retelling of history. Are there some lessons here about adding guardrails to the National Park Service and other interpretive sites that are run by the government in order to prevent an administration in the future from just being able to rewrite history on a whim?
Well, that's another great question. And I think what we're looking at right now is there's some of us who are small O optimists who actually think that we might get the opportunity to build back and not just build back, but build back better and not the same. And so the guardrails that you're talking about, does that look like something in legislation? Does it go to maybe the foundation documents or the enabling legislation of national parks that require the National Park Service to think broadly? A really interesting example along this point is, again, going back to Fort Pulaski in Georgia. If you look at the foundation document for that park, which was established by Calvin Coolidge in 1924, I think, it's all about the fort. It's all about the masonry. It's all about the natural landscape that's around the fort. And so, technically, even though that was a fortress that was used during the American Civil War, there is no obligation for the Park Service who are there to talk about race and slavery. So, if you want a close conservative argument and a read of that enabling legislation or foundation document, yeah, maybe a photograph of the guy with the scourged back doesn't need to be up on the walls. So, do we need to create a space or the opportunity for national parks with those foundation documents and enabling legislation as we move forward, where I don't know, maybe there's some sort of placeholder that says you will talk about all the things that are current threads of thinking throughout the country at the time of historic or cultural significance. Um, and you get to a point where you have a new national monument like Fort Monroe, which was established in 2011, President Obama's first national monument designation, my first national monument campaign for NPCA. And the study of race, the study of slavery is all over that. And so it would be more difficult, not impossible, but more difficult for someone to go down there and say, you guys can't talk about race and slavery. That's one of the reasons why that was established. So we need to have the guardrails in place. I would also just add real quick, 2025 was an interesting year. And I think many people in the conservation preservation space, federal employees, government workers, maybe even some people in the administration, and certainly people in my space, advocacy organizations or preservation organizations and nonprofits, for the first 6 months, we were just standing there like, it was like a scene out of a Three Stooges movie, and just the hose was being blasted at us. And so I think there was, we have never seen anything like this before. Use of the word unprecedented became unprecedented in 2025. And we are now getting to a point where I think we're finding our feet and trying to figure out how we begin effectively to push back individually and in coalition against some of the nonsense that we're seeing coming forward. Um, so guardrails in the future, absolutely. Us finding our feet at this point in time and moving forward, that's another part of it as well.
Well, I think another part of it is this sense, and I think we did see this across the conservation world in 2025, is this kind of stay in your lane sense. Well, we're a conservation organization, we're not a history organization, so is it really our place to worry about signs in national parks? I mean, can you, I guess, either draw the connection between the two, land conservation, history conservation, or just what's the make me care line? So you care about the outdoors. Why is it important to care about history too?
If you care about national parks, if you care about Yellowstone and Yosemite, and really don't give a toss about Clara Barton or Frederick Douglass or Stonewall, then here's my appeal. We want the largest, most engaged, most well informed stewardship and constituency for national parks that we can manage, because that's how we win. That's how we win on issues of funding. That's how we win on issues of advocacy and policy, is making sure that we've got a lot of people with us. So the next time someone comes up with the brilliant idea to take over a quarter of Manassas National Battlefield to put up an outlet mall, or they want to do uranium mining on the edge of the Grand Canyon, or maybe in the Grand Canyon, we've got a really informed, engaged constituency that can oppose those sorts of things. And so, if you are interested in developing that kind of a constituency, then you have to work assiduously to make sure that parks are relevant to the widest possible scope of people. So, again, you don't care a toss about historic and cultural resources. There are a lot of people out there who love history and cultural resources who don't give a damn about elk. So, we got to figure out a way to meet in the middle. We got to figure out a way to let the cannon people understand that cannons need love too, and they need good policy too. We got to protect Vicksburg, and we've got to protect Hawaii volcanoes.
So I was going to ask you at some point in this interview uh, about I think your approach to history. If I'm not mistaken, you were a women's studies major for your undergraduate degree. And how does that approach to an intersectional approach to history inform your work now with a conservation group? And maybe you halfway answered that already. But
I'd be happy
you
to
do you take
halfway
a very
answer it
holistic view
again.
here. Yeah.
No, I had a concentration in women's studies at a Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and that was only because the department had not yet formed around women's studies, so there was no way to get a minor or even a major in that. But a really wonderful professor, Dr. Cynthia Inlow, who just recently retired from Clark, was just this magnificent lecturer, but also a very human person in the way that she engaged with her students. And so I really fell in love with the way that she taught. And falling in love with the way that she taught meant that I had to have an affinity for feminism and for women's studies. And then also for learning that sometimes the traditional narrative that we have grown up with, that I had grown up with, didn't always get it right completely. I'm a native of Washington, D.C. I think this is one of the most beautiful cities on the planet. But if you walk down downtown Washington, D.C., and go through all the circles and the squares, it's a bunch of guys on horseback with swords. And it becomes abundantly clear really quickly that black and brown people and women and queer people had not a damn thing to do with the formation of this country if we're going by the statues. And so clearly that's not true. And so I think my approach to history has always been about trying to uncover the stories that were maybe deliberately overlooked or neglected, the things that have been hidden, the stories we lost during Reconstruction, and to make sure that, and one of the most important things that I learned as a student in taking women's studies classes and classes on history is you always have to ask the question, which is the thing that I admire most about the National Park Service, is they're great at asking the question, which is if you're going to talk about the Second World War and you're going to talk about the Dauntless SBD dive bomber and the A6M Zero fighter plane, then you also have to take a moment and stop and ask the question, so what did labor have to do with this? What was the impact and influence of women? What was the impact and influence of queer people, black and brown people, both in the workforce on the home front, but then in the prosecution of the war itself? And it is entirely possible that when you ask those questions, you have to be prepared to hear that the answer is going to be, well, they didn't have any. But in almost every instance that I've ever examined as a historical thread or theme or subject, the answer to that question is always yes. And we need to learn more if we want to have an accurate and inclusive and interesting history. And I'm going to use the F word, fun. You've got to have all these different threads incorporated into these stories, and because it's our shared national narrative. And so, while there is an effort right now to exclude people, I think the best interest and the best way that we can move forward as historians and people who love American history is to actually pry that process back open and make it as inclusive as we possibly can, because that's where the complexity comes from, and that's where the inspiration comes from, at least for me.
What does that look like this year in particular when there is this focus on history? There is at least awareness now of what the administration is trying to do to rewrite or erase parts of that history. So, how can all of us as Americans start to reclaim that? Say we're going to have a full telling of history, whether the Park Service wants to or not this summer. How do folks getting out there, doing these events, going to these sites, how can they make sure that they are bringing with their families a more complete telling of American history?
I think it goes back to being able to ask that question fundamentally, which is remember when an interpretive ranger, and I'm speaking for an agency that I've never worked for, and I'm speaking for all interpretive rangers right now, please forgive me, folks. Um, when you or your family or you and your friends go out and an interpretive ranger comes out and they've usually got a notebook with some facts and figures in it, um, there is sometimes an assumption that they are the only authority and that your responsibility is to shut up, be silent, and take in all the information that they have to convey. And I would say you don't ever want to interrupt people to a point where you become a nuisance, but you do want to be able to say, so I'm hearing all about the military campaigns that happened at a place like Gettysburg, or the military elements that were attached to the siege of Yorktown in September and October of 1781. I haven't heard anything about enslaved people. I haven't heard anything about indigenous people. I haven't heard anything about women. I haven't heard anything about labor. Um, and it's entirely possible, again, that the answer from that expert might be, well, there's just no notes on that. But most likely, if you've got a good interpreter, and I think that applies to about 98.9% of all NPS interpreters at this point in time in the business, then you're going to get someone who says, I'm funny you should ask about women, because I've got some information that I was able to do some research and was able to uncover about their role in this particular story, in this particular history. And so I think it's asking that question. And then, if I might, I mean, this is not a paid endorsement, but if you look at something like, Ken Burns' series on the American Revolution, which is full of narrative speed bumps. Okay, we beat the British. What did the tribes think about that? What was their relationship? How were not only white women like Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren engaged in this, but how were African American women, both free and enslaved, being impacted by this war, impacting this war? And so I think it's clear, and you don't always have to be someone who has the resources of a Ken Burns, one of the best documentarians in the business, but you can try to seek out as many broad opinions as you possibly can. We have started by covering the fact that I think that slavery was a root cause of the American Civil War. It was unfinished business during our foundational period. I read books by people who don't believe that to be the case because I'm interested in hearing their arguments. And I'm not looking to have their books removed from a National Park Service bookshelf, but just, you know, listen, um, if you are somebody who doesn't want to have their life complicated by information that gets you to think critically about where this country has come from, there are hundreds of thousands of places in this country where you can go knock yourself out at Six Flags. But what I'm asking is, don't ruin it for the rest of us who actually do go to national parks or who do go to the Smithsonian to get this kind of inspirational learning and background on who we are as a people and where we've come from. Don't ruin it for the rest of us.
As we're talking today, it's Wednesday the 18th. The New York Times today published a major investigation reporting that Cesar Chavez, civil rights and labor icon, also groomed and sexually abused multiple girls, including at the United Farm Workers Office. Dolores Huerta, his co-leader, told the Times that Chavez sexually assaulted her back in 1966. And my first thought, obviously, is this is awful. My second thought, unfortunately, is how awful that at this moment, the National Park Service, under this leadership, has to figure out how to integrate this new history into the story of Cesar Chavez and the labor movement at one of our newer national monuments. I wonder, just do you have thoughts on what that process would look like under a normal functioning administration? How do you integrate this in the same way that you integrate George Washington did great things for America and owned enslaved people? How do you integrate a story like that in this moment when there is so much pressure as it is to erase the history that we even knew before?
Well, I read the New York Times article this morning. It really hurt to read that. Um, but it hurt a lot more for those victims to live through that and to live through silently as the campaign to designate a national monument honoring Cesar Chavez and his work with the United Farm Workers was moved forward. So my first thought is with the victims. Um, in terms of how this process gets played out and how it gets handled, I think the idea is now that these women have come forward, they need to be heard, they need to be embraced, they need to be supported. And then we figure out what happens with the interpretation, we figure out what happens with the national monument. Does that now become, in addition to something that talks about United Farm Workers, does it come to talk about, sexual predation and victims' rights, other things like that? I don't know. I think that it would be a good thing to see a very thorough process of investigation followed by a very thorough process and a well-reasoned decision about how to handle this going forward, and not just something that is, as the removals process has been, arbitrary and capricious. I'm not looking for something that gets drawn out for years and years and years. These women have already suffered enough in silence.
Don't want to leave us on that note, but I think it was important to bring up.
Mhm.
But I do want to ask about looking to the future. Despite all of this, the executive orders, the firings, the removed exhibits, are there things that are giving you hope right now for what America's history, how we tell America's history, what that looks like 5 years, 10 years down the road? As you said, we are at least tiptoeing with authoritarianism, but maybe we're not all the way there yet. So is there a way out? Is there a good possible outcome in addition to a more bleak one?
Um, I think I'm obligated to say yes. Again, small o optimism. It starts with the fact that we still have people in the National Park Service who, on some of the most challenging circumstances, still show up every day, put on that uniform, and do their work with pride. And so I think then that obligates me to show up for them as an advocate for national parks. And we have been through challenging times before. Not sure we've ever seen anything exactly like this, but what I remember, the stories that I remember, it's like in the middle of the start of the Second World War when victory on the Allied side against fascism was not assured. And we had a Defense Department that said, we want to cut down redwoods because we need them for aircraft manufacturing. And the government, based on the feedback from the people, basically said, no, these are resources that we want to protect. These are worthy of protecting in perpetuity for the benefit, enjoyment, and inspiration of the public. I go back to that horrible bloody summer of 1864 in Abraham Lincoln's first administration. And during the summer, that saw some of the most bloody fighting at places like Spotsylvania Courthouse. Um, he put through the Yosemite Land Grant Act, which led to ultimately the establishment of Yosemite National Park. So the preservation of our historic and cultural and natural resources has always been a priority. And when I was a young kid in Washington, D.C., growing up, and my parents were looking for fun, inexpensive things to do with their only kid, and I made my first trip to Gettysburg, there was something just so totally awesome about that landscape. Statues of guys with guns and paintings of guys with guns and cannons. This is long before I got to women's studies. Um, but what it did for me was, even as a 10-year-old black kid from Washington, D.C., I found it to be really neat that ages ago someone thought it was important to protect Cemetery Ridge and Devil's Den, and that I was walking those same landscapes at this point in the 1970s with my parents, and that I was learning about this history too. And, you know, didn't necessarily mean that I had a direct contact at Gettysburg in terms of history, but yeah, that's a part of our story. It's a part of my history. And so the optimism that I think I'm obligated to express here, that I'm obligated to have, is that we want to make sure that the next 10-year-old kid who goes to Gettysburg or Harper's Ferry or the Everglades or Shenandoah or Big Thicket or Fort Davis or the Grand Canyon can have that same opportunity to interact with landscapes, with history, with culture, and with Park Service staff that will just make their socks roll up and down.
That is a great place to leave it. Alan Spears, National Parks Conservation Association, thank you for all of the work you do and that NPCA does. Appreciate it, and I hope we have you back in a couple of years to talk about what we're doing to erase the erasure, perhaps.
Talk about how it's all worked out perfectly. Yeah, I'd love to come back.
And let's wrap with a little good news. Colorado just got a new state wildlife area. The Conservation Fund protected 3,300 acres near the Continental Divide called Tolland Ranch. It's a historic property less than an hour from Denver. It's been with one family since 1893. The property will now be managed by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. There's elk habitat, nearly 100 species of nesting birds, 3.5 miles of trout fishing on South Boulder Creek, hooray for stream access, and 18 miles of cross-country ski trails. Hunting and fishing there could open as early as this fall. This is the sort of deal that makes you remember what conservation is supposed to look like. Well, that'll do it for us on this episode of The Landscape. Thanks again to Alan Spears for joining us and for all of his insight. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. If you are watching us on YouTube, hit that like and subscribe button. We'll be back in a couple weeks. In the meantime, go enjoy your spring. Thank you for listening to The Landscape.